Salutations, I'm George from Ireland. This video is a review of a book by Ben Shapiro, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Well, Mr. Shapiro, he's renowned as a rhetor, and he's a right-wing hack to his opponents. He's certainly a glib and guileful debater, a YouTube sensation. So this book is really the thinking man's MAGA. It's the thinking man's Make America Great Again slogan, writ large, 250 pages of it. There are jaded old memes about the iniquities of commies and the goodness of God. It's not all furphy though. So this book, its title might as well be USA, USA. So it's verbal flag waving. Now, I wouldn't want to go the other way. Countries shouldn't be too intro-punitive either. And that's also perverse. So this book is, as one would expect, a broadside against the liberal left. And it got a lot of backslapping from Fox News, this book. So I think the Democrats will be left speechless by this book. It's not explicitly partisan, because Mr. Shapiro cunningly always calls himself a conservative, not a Republican as such, saying that he had moral concerns about Trump. Well, I've heard scarcely a word in condemnation of President Trump from this gentleman. So, as a very familiar starting point, Western civilization is in mortal peril, and freedom is based on us being created in the image of God. How do we know that? Well, I'll come on to that. We're all capable of reason. So these are the main two things, Imago Dei, and we're all able to reason things out. So this is hailed as a magisterial revelation by the conservative commentariat. The trouble is, if you're not a religious person, well, then you're just out straight away. This book is not for you. Won't be convinced by it. You can't believe what he says. The second bit, that we're all capable of reason, well, that's a bit contentious as well. Even highly intelligent people, their cognitive faculties are sometimes impaired by their prejudices. So Mr. Shapiro is regarded as an intellectual heavyweight. Indeed, even his most implacable foe couldn't say he's dim. So the book is quite divisive. There's a lot of us and them. Now, that's okay. We don't need a mindless big tent. We should stir it up a little bit. Don't have to pretend we agree about everything. So the book is a lengthy valentine to the splendor of America. And there are many paeans about its political liberty. Mr. Shapiro is really preaching to the converted. If you read the reviews, there are a few people who are not of his ilk who read the book. But 9 out of 10 of them, they're people who I suppose would be minded to concur with what he said. I'm one of those people who insist on exposing myself to works even if I know it'll irk me, because there'll be something worthwhile in it. And this book is no exception, because it is penned by a very capable polemicist. So the book isn't all bunkum. His nemeses are mine, all right? Hitler was diabolical, right? That's not an insight. So the book is not all nonsense, and some of the statements in it are not contentious, but I think you will search in vain here for revelations. If you think this is groundbreaking, you're likely to be disappointed. So it's all about how America is founded on the judeo-christian ethical tradition and Athenian philosophy. But and then it's about the West in general, actually, as well. But the odd thing is, and this is the very worthwhile question he never asks, why is the United States so disharmonious in relation to other countries with the same philosophical tradition? And reason and superstition make very strange bedfellows. That's to say, religion and this questioning philosophy, skepticism. They're inimical to each other, aren't they? It's illogical to suggest that mythology and reason are really the same thing, or they're allies. They're not. They're enemies, surely. So Greek philosophy, harking back to Socrates, and he had a profound impression on me, question everything. And it's ironic that this book should be valorizing Greek philosophy when this book really is hemlock in print, saying that those who question these shibboleths, well, they're just the height of immorality. So at the same time, he believes in faith. Take things on trust. take it from me. It's the argument from authority. I am whoever, the prophet. This is Holy Writ. It's in this Iron Age text. Therefore, thou shalt believe. So, and that seems to be one of the feeblest parts of the book, and really contradicts the other thrust of it, that we are capable of logical reasoning. So he doesn't apply the same spirit of inquiry to Holy Writ. Why is it we should assume that this is divinely inspired and that it's somehow morally improving? So Mr. Shapiro is, as usual, peddling these self-serving myths throughout his work, and often these are easily debunked, the historical examples that he cites. So they don't withstand scrutiny. The idea that Western countries are somehow morally superior is risibly one-sided in the samples he selects. In fairness to him, he will occasionally point out some trivial exceptions to the overall thrust of his argument. So the book is sometimes anodyne. Of course, it's difficult to distill 3 millennia of philosophy into a mere 250 pages. So necessarily, one is forced to be ruthlessly selective in culling what's going to be included and excluding the vast majority. So the book is jam-packed with American self-congratulation and, more broadly, Occidental self-laudation. So there's snootiness in it, which is entirely as to be expected. Anyway, he's proselytizing for religion and the grand old party, although he doesn't explicitly put on a Republican cap. The judeo-christian tradition. The book is peppered with that expression. So, but aren't Judaism and Christianity mutually exclusive? Either Jesus Christ is the Messiah, or he's not. And obviously, Jesus was executed by the Jewish authorities as a heretic. So they were at loggerheads from the very beginning. Only in the last century or so, mainly in the United States, have Jewish and Christian clergy got together and say, oh, we're more or less the same thing. And yes, it's true that the Christian Bible, well, I mean, most of it is Jewish, like 3/4 of it, and the Christians just copied most of their religion from the Jews. So there's a lot of disparaging of the non-Western contribution to civilization, and the book does not grapple with the uncomfortable fact that for centuries, the Indians, the Chinese, and dare I say the Arabs, were light years ahead of the Western world in terms of science, technology, or sometimes just how humane they were. But that's the thing, is civilizations, they advance, they regress, they advance, they regress, in no particular pattern. So he has to simplify this to such a degree that really it's perverting the truth. You know, in the 17th century, when some of these English Puritans arrived in the United States, dangerous extremists, they were regarded in their homeland, they observed that the Native Americans very rarely beat their children, whereas beating your children was par for the course in England at the time. And so in that sense, the Native Americans were more humane. Plus ça change. So this book is crammed with fairy tales of Western moral superiority. All right, it isn't all drivel. Yes, there are times when Westerners were moral superior, and there were white saviors. These things are not entirely fallacious. But there's a lot there about the American dream and the United States being the land of opportunity, even though in the United States there's really less opportunity for someone born poor than there is in almost any other Western country. So in that wise, it's a fundamentally dishonest book, perpetuating this notion that really everybody has an equal opportunity in the United States, that, you know, college isn't sort of more or less beyond the financial means of the poorest people. And yes, if you do get a bachelor's degree, you'll be $100,000 in debt and therefore massively disadvantaged starting your career versus your more affluent peers and things like that. So the stats do not vindicate him if you contrast the United States with, you know, some certain Western European countries with, dare I mention, social democratic systems with extensive welfare and higher education free of charge, who are going to have greater longevity, lower child mortality, lower prison populations, lower crime in general, a cleaner environment, lower suicide rate, greater gender equality. I mean, I could go on and on by almost any metric, streets ahead. So really, this is the central thesis of Mr. Shapiro's tome, that America has got a God-shaped hole at its heart. What a specious claim. It's the most religious country in the Western world. But it's not godly enough. So you want more religion. Okay, Islam? No, Buddhism? Rastafari? Satanism? It's a religion. He's a god of a kind, the peacock angel. No, he doesn't want Lucifer, a fallen angel. So, but anyway, this whole, if we don't have God there, we will fill it with hate. Good point. Almost as though religious people never hate. In the Old Testament, what does it tell you to do to people of old religions? To hew down their statues and to burn their temple and blah, blah, blah. And God will command the children of Israel, you see the land beyond there, you are ordered to take it by the sword and spare none of any age, sex, or condition. Simply take the land for yourselves, even kill their oxen sometimes. So it is absolute bunkum when he says that sort of thing. He constantly excoriates his opponents, but of course he doesn't hate. Well, fair enough. I don't think he actually goes so far as to hate people. He often wishes to demean people, as he'll say himself, to humiliate them. That's the word he's used in YouTube videos, humiliate his interlocutors. So this is a sort of dialogue of the deaf, bombarding them with condescension and insults, trying to destroy them. And he does use the word destroy in other texts about what he wants to do to the left. So this is not exactly sweet reason, decency, and the sort of civil behaviour that he's sometimes calling for. He's not raising the moral tone there, is he, when he seeks to annihilate those who happen not to see eye to eye with him on various issues. That's not gentlemanly conduct, is it? It's full of ad personam when he's debating people, using these epithets, these snide remarks. And I know his opponents are just as bad. So go back to an era when the United States was much more religious. It wasn't a demi-paradise then. Take even the Deep South of the 1960s, when religious fundamentalism was even more prevalent than it is today, and the Ku Klux Klan was thriving, and there were Jim Crow laws. It was a grossly unjust situation, and sharecroppers were a helot class, living in semi-slavery. A century ago, you see where the United States was, much worse than today. Almost everyone in the world was much worse off, and not just because of technology, because technology wasn't so advanced. Anyway, the whole theory that religion necessarily makes us more ethical is nonsense. There are a few people who make more ethical, there's some people who make less ethical, and there's some people it'll have no effect on. And the reverse is also true of non-religious people. So as a society, we're forgetting almost everything great that has ever happened in the history happened because of people who believed in both judeo-christian values and the Greek-born power of reason. That's what Mr. Shapiro had to say. Now, even if there were fantastic inventions by people who believed in these things, that's not to say they invented them because of Judaism or Christianity. Like the telephone wasn't invented because of Christianity or Judaism, or the radio, or gravity discovered, that kind of thing. Okay, Greek-born power of reason. I mean, did nobody else have reason before the ancient Greeks came along? The Babylonians didn't or something? Were they able to build their hanging gardens? I mean, the Chinese, when they knew so much about the stars, they invented gunpowder and printing. That was something that was nothing to do with reason. I suspect it was, actually. It wasn't just by sheer happenstance. So, much of what he's calling for does not bear resemblance to ancient Greece, thankfully. He's not wanting to introduce slavery. So, Judaism and Christianity, they don't actually have very much in common with the ancient Greek way of thinking, with polytheism. And the Greeks didn't have this good-evil duality, right? They weren't Manichaean like that as well, so they got the word from another Middle Eastern faith to give us that, Manichaean. Okay, the Greeks aren't really Middle Eastern, but they're close. So they had gods and goddesses, they had nymphs as well, they had demigods, and the titans. The ancient Greeks, they believed their pantheon was vain, petty, lascivious, revengeful, had all the human vices as well as virtues. So really it was not morally uplifting. And Hades, their underworld, it wasn't all bad. You could have a rather good time down there. And the Elysian fields, that's heaven, wasn't simply for those who did what was moral, not in our terms, but simply for those who propitiated the pantheon by making the right sacrifices, performing the right observances, reciting the litany. It was nothing to do with helping others and not harming others. So this book is really caressing the egos of Americans who are suffering anxiety. They're perturbed because their bedrock beliefs have been questioned, and they tend not to be self-questioning sort of people who would agree with Mr. Shapiro. So he's constantly exalting his own country. And all right, there's a lot to admire in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of technological and scientific innovation, and castigating America's foes, and castigating other Americans for not being American enough, which means judeo-christian enough, and Athenian enough, and so on. So really, he's hoodwinking his readers, the sort of people who wouldn't go back to the original text. All right, they might read the Bible, but they wouldn't dip into too much Greek philosophy. So I'm afraid to say he is a shill. But when he talks about Greek, he really means Athenian. I don't think he wants Sparta with the Helots, with it being militaristic, although there is a militaristic aspect to the United States. So it's a shaky moment for this presupposition of Western superiority. China is breathing down America's neck economically, and the United States is engaged in these forever wars that the United States doesn't really seem inclined to actually win or either withdraw from in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and constantly casting around for the next villain. So this book is like a ticker tape parade for self-flattering falsehood. But as I said, not all the statements in it are bogus, and there are things which are praiseworthy about the United States. You know, at least most adults get to vote, and you have quite a lot of choice in what you do, quite a lot of choice in your personal sphere. But his historical synopsis is not watertight, to say the least. He's obviously selected to flatter. I could drive a coach and four through all his claims that the West is so morally superior and did all these things before other people did. Okay, there are times when it did do morally good things, and obviously it was opposed by the most conservative people. And who's in the conservative tradition? It's Mr. Shapiro. Now, admittedly, what counts as conservatism now would have been seen as very, very liberal in the 19th century. He bases his argument, if I don't flatter him too much calling it that, on the childish assumption that history is this eternal battle between good and evil, and they're slogging it out. Goodies and baddies. It's very blinker to think that, all right, there is such a thing as good and bad, but really it's a mixed picture, it's chaotic, it's not tidy, it's not dualistic. He's too categorical. And people are principally actuated by self-interest. It should be obvious that they're chiefly motivated by what's in it for me, what's going to keep me safe. I better not say anything that will be terribly unpopular in my community. I'll be ostracized or worse. And so people will trick themselves into believing that their side is good and the other side is wicked and all the rest of it. So going back to ancient Athens, Socrates questioned the totems of his day. The United States today, these totems that are held up in such high regard are religion, are democracy, this notion of inherent superiority, capitalism, the military-industrial complex, economic inequality, a lack of affordable healthcare, the fact there's no gun control. And these are the things that Mr. Shapiro won't go against. He's saying, no, absolutely right, we've got to keep it this way. Now, these things that I mentioned, they're not all bad. But he doesn't seriously question them. And indeed, he inveighs against those who oppose the current dispensation. So Europe is so wrong, that's what he's saying. Well, the status quo there is so dreadful. Isn't it odd? Because these places are based on, ancient Greek philosophy, and you might say judeo-christianity as well. And I would suspect the classics are studied rather more in European countries now in the United States. I mean, quite a few people in European countries learn Latin at school. Almost nobody in the United States learns Latin there. And a few people learn ancient Greek in European countries, in the UK, for example. And again, very, very few people would learn it in the United States. So he starts from the premise that Judaism and the West must be morally upstanding, and Christianity. I don't know why I would assume that. They might be. And there are some good things about both Judaism and the Western world, but they're not overwhelmingly good. Somewhat they're neutral. Other zones of the world could be morally good too. Other faiths could have some good precepts in them. So it's the West versus the rest. And you can guess whose side he's on. So it seems to be just this really foolish assumption that, well, I'm born here, so it must be good. Are the West and the West, are they really in competition necessarily? Need there be enmity between them? I don't think so. So it's very misleading. You'll see a lot of sleight of hand. And by the way, where is the West? Okay, we know it's Europe. Up until when? Up until Poland? Up until Russia? The Urals into Russia? Or what? Does it include Turkey or not? Some people regard it as European. Istanbul is, well, the western side of Istanbul. How about Mexico? Western country, not Western? I'm not sure, it's not clear. South Africa? Most people there can speak English, it's quite developed. I've heard South Africans say it's a Western country, I don't know. Is Singapore, very highly developed country, completely English speaking, some sort of democracy, is that Western? I don't know. So it's very unclear here. So it's disingenuous throughout to constantly trying to valorize the Western world. And, I know he absolutely abominates abortion, thinks it's the final horror. By the way, the ancient Greeks practiced it without scruple, as the US Supreme Court stated in Roe and Wade. So Jews and Greeks believe the same thing, according to Mr. Shapiro. How did they get on in ancient times? Alexander the Great, he didn't conquer Judea, did he? Judas Maccabeus, he didn't have to fight against the ancient Greeks, did he? I think you'll find they were at daggers drawn, and then Jewish people became Hellenized, were abominated by their brethren. So, anyway, he's not much of a historian. I don't think much of his punditry either. Mr. Shapiro is a neo-Victorian. And I remember one of his earlier books, his main contribution to Western philosophy was to say, do not masturbate. Thanks, Ben. That really helped me a lot, hearing that, how you really gained from not committing onanism. So Mr. Shapiro is a combative sport, always spoiling for a fight, and this book is tendentious in his trademark manner. So I remember he mentioned earlier on that people are trying to prevent him speaking in places, and of course that's loathsome. It's very bad of people. No one should stop him speaking. Of course he's got the right to express his views. But his book, it drips with chauvinism, with self-delusion. This is my side bias as its most extreme. Cherry-picking all the examples which will show the Occident in the most favourable light. It's a highly partisan book, a very skewed version of history, and is almost baffling that he can get away with this willful misreading of the past, and then people think it's plausible, replete with spurious claims. And he only cites examples which are going to buttress the case that he wishes to advance. So it's couched in highly emotive language. But then again, hey Ben, facts don't care about your feelings. The annals are disregarded when they disprove his case about horrific things that Westerners have done, that Christians have done, occasionally Jewish people have done, those who believed in ancient Greek philosophy like, John Locke, him providing, that helped write the Charter for North Carolina and therefore slavery and things like that, as grossly immoral as can be imagined. So he twists the narrative around this preconceived notion that the West must be better than others, not just more scientifically knowledgeable, but also more moral. It's a gross distortion of history. So dip into the Chronicles and you'll see where he's gone wrong. Now, there are laudable things about Western philosophy, don't get me wrong, but they're not always right, or they're not automatically the best. We have got to learn from other civilizations and be a little bit humble. So talking about the power of reason is that's one of his premises. Yeah, this is what can make us better, but ratiocination is not something that most people are blessed with in abundance. And the religious reason less than the non-religious. We also emote. Even those rational people are subject to various cognitive biases. They have loyalties. They're under psychological pressure from their peers. So we opine, and not just in a rational way. So look at countries which are not as religious as he wants, and where they're in the Human Development Index, as I say, like Denmark and Finland and so on, they're much, much higher. Finland has got about the lowest church attendance in the world, 2%. And the US, the reverse is the case. Lower in a Human Development Index, despite being more religious. And look at different states, let's say New York or California, more fairly prosperous states, and less religious, but West Virginia, highly religious, but one of the poorest states in the Union. So it doesn't really nothing to do with that. On their counterexamples, I'm honest enough to mention Utah, with very high church attendance and yet very prosperous. So there's no relationship here. There's no correlation. It's not even an inverse relationship. So he's outlandish in suggesting that religion makes us know more, or get more scientific discoveries, or make us wealthier or more peaceable. The reverse can be the case. Like George Bernard Shaw said, politics hath slain its thousands, but religion hath slain its tens of thousands. And the most extreme ideologies are to an extent a religion. Anyway, Nigeria is very religious. Must be better there. Must be rich and more peaceful there, right? Or Pakistan, extraordinarily religious. And obviously, the Quran is largely copied from the Bible, borrowed rabbinical preachments as well. Afghanistan, very religious. This is an Abrahamic religion they believe in. As they come back to Nigeria, half of them are Christians. So Western civilization gave us science, human rights, peace, progress, artistic beauty, so he says. Now, some of these are flagrantly false claims. Like, well, Iraq, they had writing and a bit of science before the Greeks did. It was Babylonia. We might call it Mesopotamia in those days. That's the earliest writing. Or indeed ancient Egypt. And the Greeks learned from the Egyptians, not the reverse. India invented human rights. Ashok, okay? Or in ancient Persia, they'd abolished slavery. I know it came back. Ancient India had panchayats, village-level councils. So, and even some various African peoples have invented their own sort of communal councils. It's a democracy in its most basic form. So there's some honking factual errors when he says that kind of thing from the fact man. France reinvented human rights in 1789, a country that many American Republicans would spit at the mention of. So progress comes and goes. We advance, we regress, we advance again. There's no rhyme or reason to it. I know you'd like to think it's tidy and linear, but it isn't. So think to the Reformation in the 1520s in Europe, and that was caused by the Renaissance. A rebirth of classical learning. So discovering what the Greeks had. But this very skepticism that we got from the Greeks led to the Reformation, as I would say, and led to scientific breakthroughs. So it's not that the two were in concert. They were, how to put it, they were in competition at best, perhaps at daggers drawn. And how did we get this rebirth of classical learning? Why did all these books from ancient Greece and ancient Rome move around Europe? Well, really, we can thank the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks who conquered Constantinople, and so a lot of Greek scholars fled west, taking their libraries with them. So religion was often anti-scientific. Have you heard of what happened to Galileo or Copernicus, being forced to recant, having been forced to come out with this nonsense that the world was the center of the universe? So in the Enlightenment, the scales fell from our eyes, and we rejected superstition. And they come on to the theory of evolution, and of course, the religious authorities fought tooth and nail against this, wanted the book burnt. Think of the monkey trials in the United States in the 1920s. Mr. Scopes put on trial William Bryan Jennings, the prosecutor, and Clarence Darrow defending about science questioning religion. So much of this book is ahistorical drivel. And as for Christianity abolishing slavery, well, it continued slavery. We know that the religious fundamentalists were arguing for it. Fair enough, there were some who were against it. But I'm sorry to say that the religious maniacs were correct. Genesis chapter 9. The slavery of African people is specifically permitted according to that. Now, I think it's absolutely outrageous, and I'm completely against that. But I'm just telling you what your good book says. The Grimke sisters, they were very religious people, and they campaigned against slavery. But they pointed out there were dozens of ministers in the American South who owned slaves. The Church of England, as an institution, owned slaves. The Orthodox Church in Romania owned gypsies as slaves till 1859. So religion gave us peace, he said. I mean, that is laughable. Has he heard of the Crusades? Or even Catholic Christians fighting Orthodox Christians? Or the Albigensian Crusade in France, when Christians killed other Christians, Cathars, for, having the wrong belief. So just hair-splitting doctrinal differences. The Pope has an army even to this day. That's not being a pacifist. Christians attacked pagans in Lithuania in the Middle Ages. The 30 Years' War, a third of the population of Germany slaughtered two different religious denominations, Christian ones, against each other. Or the conquistadores, when they plundered their way across South America. You should read Bartolomeo de las Casas, a Catholic priest no less, who wrote The Destruction of the Indies, because he was so conscience-stricken by these horrific massacres they'd inflicted on the Mesoamericans that he wrote a memoir of it to protest. Look at the Northern Ireland conflict, and there were some religious maniacs on both sides there. Or even in the United States, the Mormons were killed by mainstream Christians. The idea that Christianity brought us peace couldn't be more wrong. It's just nauseating. So yes, there are some good Christians, and there are pacifist Christians, people against nuclear weapons and so on. There's a very sort of peaceniks whom Mr. Shapiro loathes. So he says that Jerusalem and Athens gave us prosperity. Well, okay, capitalism is a fantastic thing up to a point. It should be tempered with a little bit of welfare. But of course, he's against that. He's against minimum wages. And when we had unbridled capitalism, we had no publicly funded schooling. We had no, state pensions, no unemployment benefit. And I'm sure he's against Medicare and Medicaid. Big government takeover. We can't possibly have that. Let's have more suffering. And here he says, the best countries and the best societies are those with citizens who are virtuous enough to sacrifice for the common good and be willing to enforce, but are willing to be forced to sacrifice for the greater good. Well, if they're willing to, they're going to donate to charity, to taxation. You could do both. But what if they don't sacrifice? And then people are going to go without and suffer because of it. That is why we have governments, to oblige people to do things for the common weal. So pay more tax voluntarily, or what? Maybe he means charity. That will provide for welfare. So he says Jerusalem and Athens beat Nazism and communism. Well, the Nazis in their 25-point party program, they specifically say they embraced Christianity. They had a concord out with the Pope, 1933. The Nazi government of Germany, they had the improvement of the great majority of Lutheran pastors. It is true that some of these religious leaders, they gallantly spoke out against the Nazis, but overall, the record of the churches against Nazism is far worse than that of Social Democrats or even communists. And as for communism, well, nothing to do with Greek philosophy. Marx had a PhD in Greek philosophy. So I think it was from that tradition, going back to what you could say Plato and the Republic, and some sort of idea of common ownership, that developed into communism. Now, it didn't have to, it goes other ways. There are other intellectual traditions which can honestly say they draw upon ancient Greek philosophy. But the idea that it's inimical to ancient Greek philosophy is drivel. And by the way, there are many schools of thought in contention in ancient Greek philosophy. It's not a monolith. Now, if I got this right, he actually even said the Magna Carta, not Magna Carta, which is, of course, a howler. You don't say the Magna Carta. Come on. And Magna Carta giving us rights, that was vitiated, so we're said, because it was under duress that was issued. And the Pope, the year after it was issued, said, invalid, doesn't count, the king can be an absolute monarch. Despotism. Christianity was always blessing despotism. So he said that Jerusalem and Athens gave us the Treaty of Westphalia. Yeah, ended this wars of religion. What started the war of religion in the first place? Oh yeah, it was Christianity. I got to hand it to him for being hilarious, even unintentionally. So he goes in for a highly selective reading of these scriptures. His myopia as regarding the injustice committed by Christians is disgusting. They're all doing these things at heaven's command. Oh yes, we must have feudalism. People must live in semi-servitude. Well, because that's the way God has ordained it. Things like that. Yeah, we can kidnap people from Africa and hold them as slaves. But we were doing it at the same time as the Muslim Arabs were doing it. But we were morally superior. We equipped them just slightly less or something. Is that it? I don't get it. So there's a mandate for all this in the Bible. It's at heaven's command, as I say. Jerusalem and Athens gave us the Declaration of Independence. Well, there's really nothing in the Bible about it. You could try linking it back to the Declaration of Independence. The Confederate States of America said the same thing. Are they wrong? I don't think so. So Jerusalem and Athens gave us the Emancipation Proclamation. Funny it took so long, actually. Because obviously ancient Greeks specifically allowed slavery, and that was almost never questioned by them, saying a slave is a tool who happens to breathe. Property that happens to be alive. Jerusalem and Athens gave us Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Now, I know that's the best of it. Martin Luther King's his weapon of love, his peaceful campaigning for egalitarianism and justice. And if you cherry pick the good bits of the Bible, all right, the nice bits are what inspire him and ancient Greek philosophy. You just have to overlook all the hideous parts. So, anyway, Socrates was spurned in Rome, as I said, and forced to commit suicide. Anyway, Rome and the Greeks fought against each other, of course. He said that societies that spurned Athens and Greece have fallen. Look at the USSR. Well, the USSR had links with the Orthodox Church from the Second World War onwards. It was allowed. Very, very small scale, but it was allowed. And they obviously had to be a tool serving the state. And so communism was supposed to be about compassion, about the abolition of pauperism. They certainly believed in family values, the Soviet government. He would approve of that. Very much disapproved of divorce. Homosexuality was illegal. No pornography, no gambling, no drugs. They were certainly very tough on crime. They had mass incarceration. I'm sure he'd like that. But he sneers at social justice. By the way, Israel, which he adores, is all about social justice and founded by socialists. And coming back to the USSR, by the way, I admit it went very badly wrong. It's true the government was tyrannical, was heavily oppressive, killed millions and millions of its people. Stalin was as unjust as can be. Famines there were purposive. Food was removed at gunpoint. Borders were sealed. Famine was denied, even though it was going on. The denial was maintained for half a century. I could be here all night. I agree with them about the horrors of the Soviet Union, but there were some good things, especially towards the end. And as for, Nazism fell because it wasn't based on the Bible. Churches were packed in Nazi Germany, all right? As I say, they co-opted the churches. And at the same time, churches were closed in the Soviet Union up until 1941. So get your story straight. The Nazis embraced judeo-christian values. I mean, the Bible tells the Jews to commit genocide against the Canaanites. So the Nazis, they rejected Greek natural law. I think on this one he's right, though. But almost as though the Greeks didn't invade other countries, or indeed each other. They didn't enslave or slaughter other people. Talking about how Venezuela rejects judeo-christian values. Well, they're certainly allowed to go to church. People have to eat dogs. Don't know why eating dogs is worse than eating beef or something. The Chinese and Koreans eat dogs, just not part of our way of doing things. And there's severe problems in Venezuela. I hold no brief for the president. Yes, there's hyperinflation. There's malnutrition in the United States. Not to the same level as Venezuela, but the situation with food security in the US is way worse than in almost any other Western country. So really, there's not, you should copy Western European countries. Social democracy in Western Europe is better than by a country mile than the US in reducing suffering. So Shapiro rails against moral subjectivism, but his whole book is incredibly subjective. He's sort of skewering regimes he dislikes and giving a pass to ones he likes for doing all the same bad stuff, like not allowing freedom of expression, like throwing people in jail in huge numbers. So the world is equivocal. It's not about demons and angels as he would have us believe. And he would feign it's all absolutely clear-cut. It isn't straightforward. So he laments his return to tribalism in American politics, yet he bifurcates us and them. US politics, well, railing against the left and eulogizing the right. So he's about trying to pick the speck out of opponent's eye or ignore the malt in his own wrongdoing by Christians, by Jews, by those who believe in ancient Greek philosophy. So, but even if the West is on the whole better than the rest, it's not so much better as to prove that Judeo-Christian ethics and so on are really just out of this world, or they're surpassingly good, or looking back to Athens makes us morally upstanding. The difference is not as huge as he would have us believe. So he is a Puritan against hedonism. By the way, the Greeks were into symposia. They're raucously drunken parties. They were inebriates often. Okay, they were on leisure bent, and they were into pederasty as well. And some of the women had lesbian orgies in the woods. So they worshipped Bacchus. Prostitution was widely permitted. Drugs were allowed in Western countries in the 1960s. I think he'd prefer a Shariat state, no drugs, no alcohol, no gambling, big on family values, promiscuous use of the death penalty. I think it would suit him just fine, actually. Homosexuals not allowed. So he's against scientific materialism, has to be rejected. But that gives us reason, science, doesn't it? Judging on the basis of evidence, just like Mr. Shapiro doesn't like to do. He shuns authoritarianism, but he's got an area word to say against Trump. And Trump is so authoritarian himself when it comes to moral issues, trying to prescribe what people must do and what they're not permitted to do. He's against nationalistic solidarity, but he wants it for the United States and indeed Israel. Say, oh, you can't possibly criticize your country, it's the greatest, and just assume that you're superior. So he's always valorizing Judeo-Christian values and ancient Greek ones, saying the precursors of American values. To some extent, that's true. But he doesn't seem to face up to this Socratic dictum, question everything. And question everything has led to a disbelief in religion. So Christians did not like being questioned in the old days. When there was a Reformation, people were killed for trying to do that. The Counter-Reformation, people were killed for trying to bring back Catholicism. The Inquisition, people were killed for being Jewish and Muslim in particular. So Judaism and Christianity were in conflict for centuries, and Christians did not show these Christian values to Jewish people. Slavery and genocide, as I pointed out, were specifically commanded by the Holy Bible. Now, there are worthwhile things in scriptures as well about compassion, forgiveness, charity, welfare. You might even say socialism, sharing, allowing the widow and the sojourner and the orphan to glean, the kind of thing that Mr. Shapiro would hate. So he talks about the left wanting to end democracy. I don't see that, actually. The GOP is the one that goes in for voter suppression, packing and cracking, redistricting. So Trump is the one who gushes over dictators, who's fallen in love with Kim Jong-un, who likes Xi being president for life. Trump is the one who abominates free speech, who detests the media, calls them enemies of the people, fake news. But Mr. Shapiro is ever blazoning forth the glories of the USA and never criticizing Trump. Well, there's nothing original here. I've read it all before, what's in his book. It's all God Bless America. There's a very broad range of historical and philosophical allusion. He uses a rudimentary vocabulary to boil down some highly complex notions. Sometimes they're excessively simplified, and he has to misinterpret them for his own partisan ends. But I'll say this for the book: it has pace. It has to be succinct to cram it all in. So it's a pithy book. It's very readable. It's quite basic on some of the things it has to cover because it's got to be mass market. It's lucid. It's cogent in its way, but overall it's meretricious. He manages to string a narrative around a very feeble factual case and make it seem semi-plausible. But he's a lawyer and he thrills to that task. If you are an analytical type, you'll find that he struggles to sustain an argument. And he set himself a gargantuan mission. But how many self-congratulatory stereotypes can you cram into a book? Really, that's what this book is about. So telling your readership what they wish to read. So it doesn't challenge his readers with anything they might find disobliging. So telling Americans that they're great, it's money for old rope, and it's made him millions.